If you were born somewhere between 1993 and 1998, you may have noticed something strange about yourself. You can be deeply nostalgic for a world that disappeared fast. You might overthink texts, disappear for a while, then come back like nothing happened. You may crave closeness but feel weirdly exposed when people know too much about you. And even when you're social, there's often a part of you that feels slightly detached, like you're half in the moment and half observing it from the outside. It doesn't look like a big deal, but psychologically it says a lot.
Because Zillennials grew up in a very specific emotional environment.
Not fully offline, not fully online, not old enough to be untouched by the internet, but not young enough to have your whole identity built inside it. And that in-between experience shaped more than preferences. It shaped how many of you relate to attention, intimacy, identity, and even yourselves. A lot of Zillennials had a childhood that still felt relatively private. You could be awkward without it being documented forever. You could have phases that disappeared. You could be bored. You could leave the house and not be reachable every second. There was still space between you and everyone else. Then adolescence and early adulthood arrived right when everything changed. Suddenly there were profiles, timelines, likes, read receipts, public opinions, personal branding, and the quiet pressure to always be somehow visible. Not famous, just present. Present enough to exist socially, present enough to not disappear. And that timing matters. Because Zillennials grew up in a very specific self-awareness. Not just normal self-consciousness, a more layered kind. The kind where you don't just ask, how do I feel? You also ask, how does this look? How will this be read? What version of me exists in other people's minds right now? That's part of why so many Zillennials seem emotionally perceptive but mentally tired. They often notice tone shifts quickly. They can read subtext. They can feel when someone is pulling away, when a group dynamic changes, when a message feels colder than usual. From the outside, it can look like overthinking, and sometimes it is, but often it's something more specific than that. It's adaptation. When you grow up during a time where social life becomes digitized, social cues don't disappear, they multiply. Now there's what someone said, how long they took to say it, whether they liked the post, whether they viewed the story, whether they replied the same way they did last week. Small things start carrying emotional weight. So a lot of Zillennials became highly fluent in invisible signals. And that fluency can make relationships feel both intimate and exhausting. Because another common Zillennial pattern is this strange mix of wanting real connection while being very careful about emotional exposure. Many people in this group are open in a selective way. They'll share humor, references, stories, aesthetics, playlists, memes, maybe even trauma in a detached tone. But direct emotional need can feel harder to reveal. Not because they don't have depth, usually it's the opposite. It's because this generation often learned to package emotion before expressing it, to make it lighter, funnier, more digestible, to add irony, to soften the sincerity, to turn vulnerability into something safer before letting it be seen. That's why a lot of Zillennials can talk about painful things while sounding almost casual. They may say something deeply revealing, then immediately make a joke. They may disappear when they're overwhelmed, then return with humor instead of explanation. They may care intensely, but show it sideways. That's not emptiness, that's emotional self-protection. And it makes sense when you look at the timing again. This was one of the first age groups to experience the pressure of being known and watched while still emotionally developing. So many learned that being too earnest could feel risky, too visible, too open to misunderstanding. Irony became a kind of shield, humor became a social regulator, detachment became a way to stay involved without feeling fully exposed. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people think the Zillennial pattern is about indecisiveness or commitment issues or being emotionally unavailable. But the deeper pattern often has more to do with instability than immaturity. This group came of age during constant transition. Technology changed quickly. Social rules changed quickly. Dating changed quickly. Work changed quickly. Even the idea of adulthood changed. The timelines people grew up expecting started to blur. Stability stopped feeling guaranteed. So many Zillennials developed a cautious relationship with certainty. You can see it in small ways, taking a long time to answer messages because the tone has to feel right, keeping options open, not out of manipulation, but because locking in too early can feel unsafe, wanting closeness, but also needing room, being ambitious, but quietly suspicious of burnout, caring about connection, but feeling social fatigue very fast. From the outside, it can look inconsistent, but psychologically, it's often a nervous system trying to stay flexible in a world that hasn't felt very stable. That's why a lot of Zillennials feel older and younger at the same time. Older because they had to adapt fast. They witnessed the shift from one cultural world to another in real time. They learned old rules and then had to learn new ones before fully settling into the first. There's a kind of emotional weariness that comes from that. But younger, too, in a strange way, because so many traditional markers of adulthood became delayed, unstable, or emotionally detached. So there can be this constant low-level feeling of, I should feel more established than I do, even when externally things are fine. That gap creates a lot of quiet identity tension. Not dramatic crisis, more like background static. You may feel competent but not grounded, social but not fully seen, independent but still vaguely unanchored. You may miss older ways of living that felt slower and more human, even if those times weren't perfect. You may find yourself attached to old songs, old websites, old shows, old photos, old phones, old versions of yourself. That nostalgia isn't always about wanting to go backward. Sometimes it's about wanting coherence. Because when your developmental years happened across such a fast cultural transition, nostalgia can become a way of holding on to continuity. It links the self you were before constant visibility with the self you had to become after it. It gives emotional shape to a life that can otherwise feel split between eras. And that split shows up in social behavior too. Zillennials often know how to perform social ease while privately feeling drained by it. They can be good at conversation, quick with humor, emotionally intelligent, and still leave interactions feeling oddly depleted. Not because they dislike people, but because social life for them has often involved a second job in the background, reading, adjusting, managing, translating. There's also a strong sensitivity in this group to being misunderstood. That's part of why many Zillennials edit themselves so carefully. They know how fast people can flatten a person into a version, a screenshot, a take, a vibe. So there can be a strong preference for privacy, nuance, and selective visibility. Some share very little online, not because they have nothing to say, but because exposure no longer feels neutral. Others share often, but in a way that still protects the core self. Either way, the same tension is usually there underneath, the wish to be recognized without being reduced. And in relationships, this can create a familiar pattern. Zillennials often want emotional depth, but not emotional chaos. They want honesty, but not intensity that feels invasive. They want closeness that still leaves room to breathe. So they may pull away from people who come on too strong, but also feel disappointed by connections that stay too surface level. It's a very in-between emotional style, deep but careful, warm but measured, open but with layers. And that can be confusing when other people read caution as disinterest. But the real issue often isn't lack of feeling. It's that this generation learned early that once something is expressed, it can become permanent, misread, or difficult to take back. So many became people who feel first, process second, and reveal last. That's why Zillennials can seem composed while carrying a lot internally. They often function well, they show up, they adapt, they know the language of self-awareness, but beneath that, there's frequently a very specific emotional fatigue that comes from living between worlds, between analog and digital, between privacy and performance, between sincerity and irony, between old expectations and new uncertainty. And once you see that, a lot of their behavior starts to make sense. The nostalgia, the hyper-awareness, the selective vulnerability, the humor, the disappearing and returning, the discomfort with being fully perceived, the need for connection that doesn't feel consuming, the way they can seem incredibly emotionally literate and still struggle to feel fully settled inside themselves. It was never random. It was a pattern shaped by timing. Zillennials are often the psychological bridge generation, old enough to remember what life felt like before everything became content, young enough to have been formed by what came after. And living in that overlap creates a very particular kind of identity, adaptive, observant, quietly split, and often much more emotionally layered than it looks. Once you notice that, you can't really unsee it. If this explains something for you, there's more to uncover. Understanding yourself is rarely about finding one label. Sometimes it's just about finally seeing the pattern you were living inside the whole time.